Hello and welcome to Bristol Ideas. I'm Andrew Kelly. I'm joined today by Linda Kinstler. Linda is a contributing writer at The Economist's 1843 magazine. Her coverage of European politics, history and cultural affairs has appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, Guardian, Wired, Jewish Currents and more. She's a PhD candidate in rhetoric at UC Berkeley and previously studied in the UK as a Marshall Scholar. She has received numerous fellowships and awards. She lives in Washington, D.C. Her debut book is the extraordinary Come to This Court and Cry, How the Holocaust Ends. It's a book that has been praised widely. The Guardian reviewer called it a tremendous feat of storytelling, propelled by numerous twists and revelations, yet anchored by a deep moral seriousness. Enthralling. Thank you, Linda, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me here.
At the forefront of any discussion like this, we need to remember the people and the crimes committed against them. And the Holocaust in Latvia was not just a massacre, but it was a very early massacre in the Holocaust, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that is not widely understood about this period of history and is actually, quite important to our understanding of the Holocaust writ large. Because of the way World War II unfolded, the Germans had a chance to unleash their genocide upon the countries of Eastern Europe, even before the infrastructure that perhaps listeners might be more familiar with of concentration camps and trains was fully up and running. And so what you have in Eastern Europe and Ukraine and Poland and the Baltic states is what is called the Holocaust by bullets, where the killings took place face to face, where the victims were able to look their killers in the eye, where everyone watched as Jews were marched to their deaths in the middle of a town. And so it was very public in a way. And so there weren't many opportunities to say, no, we didn't know this was happening. And in Riga, it was in 1941 when you have the worst massacres against the Baltic Jewish population. In Latvia, one of the first ones took place in the Rumbala forest, which is right outside of the Riga city center, where over the course of 2 days, over 30,000 Jews were killed. And over the rest of the German occupation, the vast majority of the Jewish population was completely wiped out. And I think something that's also important to understand is that these were really lively Jewish centers. They were, Vilnius was called, the Jerusalem of the North, and there was this kind of rich history and culture there, and there were so many attempts by Jewish residents and the local Baltic populations to kind of be neighbors. The kind of Jewish Yiddish folk songs were translated into Latvian on several occasions and vice versa. And so you have this complete rupture of relations in World War II. And later you have, once the Baltic Jewish population is wiped out and the trains were up and running, deportations start arriving from Western Europe. So many families from Germany, from Amsterdam, from France did make their way to the Baltic states, and many unfortunately died there.
And the numbers were huge, weren't they? I mean, there were about 100,000 Jews in Latvia, of which less than 1,000 survived.
Yeah, I mean, it's a almost complete erasure. And the fact that Jewish life did survive is in part due to the fact that, prior to the Nazi occupation, the Soviets had occupied what was then independent Latvia and deported something like 2% of the population. Among the deportees were some Jews. And those who were lucky enough to survive, it was not at all a given, and many died along the journey. Some of them were ultimately able to return. Mm-hmm. Others, there was this famous Latvian Jewish brigade in the Soviet army. And so some of the men who fought in that were able to safely return as well. And so there were these few survivors. And, I encountered stories of one Jewish family that, had been evacuated to the east, once the front approached, they finally returned to Riga, I think in 1944, and they went to the synagogue, the only synagogue that wasn't burned down because it was too close to the city center. It risked all the other buildings. And on the synagogue doors was a list of survivors posted, and it was only something like 13 names.
Mm. Yeah. Your book starts with the search for your grandfather. Tell us about him and why you set off on this.
Yeah, I grew up not knowing really anything at all about this figure, my paternal grandfather. My mother's family they were Ukrainian Soviet Jews, and very much kind of descended from that tradition. And that was the world in which I grew up. I grew up among kind of Soviet emigre Jews in the United States. And it was only around 2014 or 2015 that we became able to learn more about my grandfather. He disappeared in 1949 after World War II. And I had always thought, that seems quite normal for this part of the world. There are many, many unhappy stories. And so I didn't really look into it beyond that. But around that time, the archives of the KGB in the Baltic states had started to emerge, and emigres had started discussing what they contained. And there were so many rumors, basically. Some of those rumors were that my grandfather was a KGB agent, but others confirmed what we suspected, which is that he had belonged during the German occupation to one of the most brutal killing units, which was called the Arājs Kommando, for at least several years. And we don't know precisely what role he played in that commando because, as I've learned in my research, titles did not stay stable and they were often not descriptive. So from that, I learned that not only he was part of this commando, and then afterwards he joined the KGB. And there's a question of whether his service in the KGB overlapped with his service, for the Nazis, if he was a double agent of some kind. We know that there were at least a handful of double agents in that killing commando who were informing on the Germans to the Soviets. And then some years after the war, he disappeared without a trace in the city of Sillamäe, which is on the northern Estonian coast. And for many years, it was a closed nuclear city because that was where uranium mining took place. So it was literally not on the map.
And just to stress, the battalion that he was likely to have been a member of was incredibly brutal, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the part of the reason that the Holocaust was the catastrophe that it was in the Baltic states and is in large part due to battalions like this, which did, undertake the Holocaust by bullets with documented zeal. It was led by a Latvian policeman named Viktor Arājs, who himself had legal training, and who was a very virulent nationalist figure. And then it was also, one of the men in that group, as I discovered, was named Herbert Cukurs, and he was very famous. He was known as the Latvian Lindbergh before the war. He was a celebrated aviator. He came to symbolize the nation, and because he would go on these long flights and he wrote newspaper articles about it, his face was so recognized by everyone, and especially the Jewish community, because he once held a talk for them about the virtues of Israel, of Palestine. And he joined this killing commando. There's a lot of documentation of him participating in the killings. And then after the war in 1965, he is assassinated by Mossad in Uruguay. And once I discovered that fact, and a few other things, I was kind of off on my way writing the book.
And a spy type novel played a part in this discovery, didn't it?
Yeah, that was one of the strangest things that I discovered. I was engaging in this process of, trying to put all the pieces together in this admittedly quite opaque history, trying to understand how Israeli security agents ended up in Uruguay targeting this Latvian Nazi, who had at some point perhaps known my grandfather, I didn't know. And I was in Riga. I discovered that there was an ongoing criminal investigation into Cukurs that sought to determine whether he was guilty or innocent of participating in the killings of Jews. And I met with the prosecutor who was handling the case. And in that meeting, he said, there's this novel that just came out, and your grandfather is a main character in it. It's about this case of Cukurs. I think you would learn a lot from it. It's fiction, but it's 90% fact. And so I went and looked for this novel, which is indeed a spy novel. And my grandfather's name is on the very first page. And he's this it's a lightly fictionalized version of his of his basic story. And then it gets kind of infinitely more grotesque from there, in which he is framed as a traitor in so many ways, but also he is the one who orchestrated the murder of Cukurs. And so, I describe it in this book as the kind of feeling of vertigo, of confronting this figure who is, a close relative, I suppose, about whom I knew very little, and then holding this book in my hands that offered a story, certainly an untrue story, but still a story about his life. It was extremely disorienting.
We'll come back to Cukurs through some of the discussions we'll have about the bigger themes in the book. But I just wanted to ask you about one thing about him, which was much made of, was that he also saved a Jewish woman during the war. What was behind that?
Yeah, so it's hard to know exactly what was behind it. I mean, that is very contested, but basically what happened was he saved a woman whose name was Miriam Keitzner. She was a young Jewish woman from Latvia. And he came to, she was imprisoned in the headquarters of the Arājs Kommando for a time, and for some reason, he decided to take interest in her case, And so he brings her to another Jewish family that he thinks she will be safe with for a time. And they end up in the Riga ghetto, and on the evening before they are to be deported to be taken to their deaths, Cukurs comes and says, "You have to come with me." And the family refuses, but Miriam says, "I'm going to go." And so she ends up living with his family in the countryside at their manor. She is taken in, she is presented as a nanny or a tutor, it's kind of ambiguous. And, some have suggested that she was Cukurs' mistress, and that's why he saved her, although that's been denied by the family. And with Cukurs and his family, she survives the war. She poses as a member of their family. She has a fake passport with their last name. And they leave for South America together after the war. So I had many conversations with her daughter, Helga, who's a really wonderful person, and herself is very interested in this history, and like me, knew very little about it when she began this journey.
And the journey that you were on took you to archives in many countries, interviews with people. You tried to interview some of Cukurs' family, but were not successful there. How open were some of these archives to you?
Well, it depended. I think, it's a funny story because there are, in many ways, this is a story about the archive, about the secrets that it holds. The KGB archives that do exist in Latvia are incredible, and the archivists there are incredibly open and helpful. And there are similar archives in Ukraine and Estonia, and there too, I really benefited a lot from the help of colleagues and scholars in the field who could kind of direct me to the relevant files. And I found myself, at one point flipping through the records of the Estonian KGB from April 1949, trying to see if there was any record of a mysterious death or suicide. And, you know, all of the agents are codenamed and their targets are also codenamed. And so you really are, you can just read through all these real life espionage cases, which was kind of incredible. But yeah, it's also a story in which the archive is subjects. It's about people. It's about living witnesses and their descendants, and how we think of survivors as rightfully as these kinds of repositories of precious knowledge. And one of the questions that my book, I hope, tries to investigate is what happens when, you know, the survivors pass away and we are left with a dearth of this knowledge. In the story of the book, there are several cases in which the children of survivors become the new repositories and in fact are deposed by legal agents. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I'm most worried about right now is that everything that has been so painstakingly collected in the archive, right, whether it's a legal document or an interrogation record or a testimony, that because we're in this really interesting historical moment now when the living survivors are passing away and we can no longer ask them directly, when did you say this, who collected the testimony, etc., that those documents are losing their force legally, but certainly not historically.
Proof and evidence is a big part of the book, as you've mentioned there, and I will come back to that. I wanted to talk first of all, though, about the search for truth and justice. You start by using the question posed by the scholar Yosef Yerushalmi about remembering and forgetting, and whether the antonym of forgetting is not remembering but justice. To talk us through that.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these kinds of beguiling lines, which is why I think the French translation is actually called The Antonym of Forgetting, which I think is a beautiful title and could very well be the title of the English version as well. And it's this, for me, it's this question that asks us to query what is justice, right? When are we satisfied that we have achieved it? And do you achieve it by memory? Do you achieve it by these formal court proceedings? Do you achieve it by public memorials? What do we do now? And it's also this question of finality, the idea that there could be a kind of final justice, which I think scholars for all of time have wondered about. Is there a formula for the ending of war? Is there a formula for ending strife? And I think that question that Yerushalmi posed was, the other reason I love it is because it's from a Le Monde poll about the trial of Klaus Barbie. And it was written by journalists. And in their response to the poll, the readers were asked, what words do you think of when you think of the trial of Barbie? Do you think of, justice or memory? And Yerushalmi, in suggesting that the readers, thought about justice, he says, maybe the journalists got it right. Maybe there is something more here that we have to be thinking about. And so I think I thought a lot about that relation because we are in this moment when the Holocaust is passing out of lived memory and into history. And that is such a fraught moment. And I think we've been anticipating it for so long, and there has been so much anxiety about what this entails. And now that we're in it, I think it requires us to confront it with, equanimity, to understand the stakes of it, and also not to recoil. I think some of what my book documents is this, impulse to look to trials for this kinds of certainty, for forensic truth, And I think, some of the audience might be familiar with the Anne Frank cold case trial, in which a former FBI agent recently, just earlier this year, announced the conclusion of a cold case investigation that had identified Anne Frank's betrayer. And for me, I look at that and I see, okay, there's this desire for forensic truth. There's this desire to know exactly who betrayed Anne Frank, exactly who pulled the trigger in the Rumbula forest. and when and how and why, even though the preponderance of evidence is there. It's not a mystery. And I don't think it's an accident that that desire for forensic truth is happening at precisely the moment when the survivors are dying out, when it's becoming that much more difficult for us to feel secure somehow. It's like the bottom is falling out from underneath us and there's this panic. And so I'm trying to speak into that moment.
And one of the most famous trials was obviously the Nuremberg trials, and that gave you the title of your book. In fact, from the closing speeches by Sir Hartney Shawcross. But this was a trial where they were trying to work out, about culpability. It wasn't about who was responsible, about the level of responsibility. Some of those questions that you've just been posing yourself there.
Yeah. You mean Nuremberg?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, what was so fascinating for me, in going back and looking at the Nuremberg story and the kinds of speeches and the archives of those who were attending was just how ad hoc it was, and of course, Philippe Sands documents this beautifully in East-West Street. And at Francine Hirsch, her volume on the Soviets at Nuremberg is just an incredible piece of history from which I learned so much. But the reason I found myself going back to it was because indeed on the body of Cukurs, the Israeli agents left this kind of ripped page of the diary of one of the kind of psychologists who was attending to the prisoners at Nuremberg. And that diary page attested to the speech of Sir Hartley Shawcross. And he said, to the judges, he said, imagine that all of humanity stands before you, kind of bedraggled after so many years of war, and comes to this court and cries, these are our laws, let them prevail. And so, of course, for me, that had to be the title. And I also think it speaks so much to the paucity of these legal proceedings, right? And to this acknowledgement that this is a lament, right? You cry in the court because you know that yes, there will be a verdict, and yes, the verdict will be inadequate. Of course, we know this, but that it is important, nevertheless, to keep continuing to show up and speak. And I think that is the paradox that so many writers and scholars of both law and history and genocide have ended up with.
We had the Eichmann trial then, some years later, and similar issues there about culpability and responsibility of, not necessarily pulling the trigger, but actually arranging for the Holocaust to be run in the way it was.
Yes. And so in many ways, I think of the story that I was telling as a sequel to the Eichmann story, to the Eichmann trial. Not only was, one of the same assassins that killed Cukurs, the lead assassin on the agent, or on the case, in fact, was one of the same agents who kidnapped Eichmann from Argentina several years earlier. And so there was a similar playbook at work. And also at the Eichmann trial, Cukurs' name is read into the record. And so it's in the same way as at Nuremberg, Eichmann's name was proclaimed by one of the defendants. And that is actually one of the events that alerted authorities to his immense role in the infrastructure of the Holocaust. Similarly, during the Eichmann trial, Cukurs' name is read into the record by a witness, a survivor from Riga, who said he is still at large, thereby suggesting, go get him, go bring him to justice. And I think, many people might be familiar with the Eichmann trial because of Hannah Arendt's report on it. And that's such an important document for me, not only because of, her approach to it, which, has been controversial in the past, but also because she has these moments where she diverts into fiction. She, not only does she at one point imagine herself in the role of judge, at the very end, she says, this sentence is not sufficient. This is how I would have proclaimed it, kind of envisioning a more expansive sense of guilt for him, that he had forfeited his right to cohabitate with the human race. But also she says, why didn't they just kill him in Argentina? Why are they bothering with this? Why didn't they just leave him on the ground? And of course, we know the answer is because that trial was so important in cementing contemporary Israel's legal system and Supreme Court. But in the Cukurs case, we have the counterfactual. We no longer need to wonder, his body was just left on the ground, in this case, in a trunk in a beachside bungalow, and we see the kind of cascade of revisionism that has followed. So for me, that was why I needed to follow this story, to see what would have happened if Eichmann had just been left.
Just before coming on to that, the one trial that people may be less well aware of is what was called Little Nuremberg in Riga, and that was in 1943.
Yeah, that was, kind of fascinating for me to discover. That was the trial of Friedrich Jeckeln, who was a very high-ranking Nazi officer. He was responsible for commanding the murders at Babin Yar, which is the largest mass grave in Eastern Europe from the Holocaust, which we can talk about. It was bombed exactly a year ago. And Jeckeln, after, completing his mission, wiping out the Jews of Kiev, he was moved to Riga to do the same there, to kind of replicate the same strategy. And his trial took place in a public theater. It was 24 hours. It was extremely expedient. It was the Soviets' attempt to say, this is how we think justice should be done. It should be expedient, and there should be no question of guilt here. Which, in the case of the Holocaust, we can kind of discuss why they did that. Churchill at one point suggested drawing up a kill list of the high-ranking Nazi officers and just murdering them in public. Why bother with all these trials? And so that's a kind of ongoing question that I have. What role did these trials serve? And in the Little Nuremberg, we have a kind of different idea of justice. It was certainly expedient, and we have to say that it was a kind of justice, although it was certainly not the kind that we recognize today.
Well, the search for justice changes through time as well, doesn't it? And as you said, people die, the personal testimony is gone. We're on to the testimony of children and grandchildren in some cases. There's a line in the book about Jewish justice where survivors give testimony for all time and which will last forever, whatever happens. But that's not the case now, is it, do you think?
Yeah, and I think, in Jewish tradition, we believe that you are not dead until, the last person forgets your story, right? As long as your name and what happened to you is told and retold, you kind of live on forever. And, I think that's tradition, but it's not law. And so what we have right now, and I think some audience members will be familiar with this, in Poland and in Latvia and in Lithuania, you do have proceedings in which the guilt and culpability of Holocaust perpetrators is in some ways, erased because the testimonies upon which those rulings or judgments were made are based upon testimonies from people who are no longer alive. And so it's a kind of epistemological question, but not really, it's just this decision, I think, that needs to be made culturally, that perhaps the time for litigating these crimes has passed, and we need to allow them to reside in historical judgment, in moral judgment, but perhaps not in legal judgment anymore. And I think what was really interesting to me was speaking to the descendants, of these survivors, one of whom happily and gladly and eagerly went to the kind of Jewish community and said, I will give my testimony. I will speak to the FBI. They can take my deposition and send it to you. I will come to the court in Riga myself if I have to. And others were more circumspect, and they said, listen, this was a very traumatic history. My mother didn't tell me much about it. I really don't have that much evidence to offer to the court. And another one who was a survivor himself, who was one of the most fascinating people I encountered over this journey, he was so important because he was the one who collected many of these testimonies in the first place. And when I approached him and I said, he was the only one I approached myself, asking him if he would contribute to the trial. And he said, I have no interest in this. What is the point anymore? I don't want to be involved in this. Like, I've already done my time. He himself was a witness at Nuremberg, and he had been through the whole rigmarole. And I thought that was kind of a beautiful, if like in some ways, many ways, heartbreaking kind of statement.
But it does mean assessing the burden of proof. Difficult, doesn't it? If witnesses don't speak, or you don't have witnesses around. And this comes up for Cukurs, doesn't it? In the attempts recently to exonerate him, not just legally, but also in cultural terms. You write about, for example, there's an exhibition, and indeed there was a musical about this.
Yeah, the musical chapter, I have to say, was one of the hardest to write. It was this, just because I found it so vile, and kind of like unworthy of attention, and yet it was such an important part of this narrative. The musical was called Cukurs, Herbert Cukurs, like James Bond, and basically suggested that he was an innocent man caught between oppressive regimes with no agency of his own. And I started looking through all these these cultural artifacts, not only the musical, but as you said, also the exhibition. There was an art exhibition that was called The Presumption of Innocence, which suggested that he had been denied the presumption of innocence implicitly. And the documents that were on display in that art exhibition were then later into evidence in the legal case. And there are novels and, works of fiction and nonfiction about this, of course. And, several scholars have dealt with the Cukurs case, and they've said, when you have this many fictionalized things or semi-fictionalized items, they produce the appearance of a consensus, right? They produce a feeling that A, this is an active cultural phenomenon, and B, there are some questions that need to be answered here, and suggest that, in fact, he was not guilty. And in fact, he had been framed. He didn't, participate in the killings of Jews. And so it was, and all of these were quite contemporary, this was over the last 10 years, within the last 10 years, all of these have come out. And so for me, it was interesting to confront this kind of Holocaust revisionism, and see it presented as a quest for truth.
One thing that also struck me was how different countries have different views on approaches to proof and culpability. So in Germany, for example, there's the crime complex, which, and then in Latvia, they want to see the dead body and so on. Sometimes you don't produce the body. And in fact, in the Holocaust, you can't produce many bodies because they were burnt or buried. It's, until the burial grounds are discovered, and we're in fact still discovering them now, I think. But it's that different approach in different countries, I think, which leads to some of those complications.
Yes, and exactly. And so one of the things that I, was working on was understanding the criminal code. How is it structured in such a way that a man who was assassinated in 1965 can still be the subject of a pretrial investigation? And, I was thinking about Kafka all the time, because I found myself tracing a case in which no one understood how it occurred. There was no named plaintiff. It was a sleeping case, meaning that, it had just been kind of left to fester for so long. And it also wasn't clear what statute it was being brought under, right? Was it a rehabilitation case, which is itself a Soviet idea? Or was it a criminal case? Or were we trying to figure out a murder here? And so all of these questions I had to figure out. But I also discovered that in Latvia, there isn't a robust kind of legal mechanism for dealing with their own perpetrators. And in many ways, this was the first case of its kind. Whereas in Germany, because of course they had a whole nation that needed to be brought to account. At first, they would treat Nazis as kind of everyday murderers, as using the same criminal code. And it was only, a decade after the war that, this kind of enterprising lawyer realized, like, listen, this is not working. We have not done denazification. Many of the Nazis are still in their old positions, and we need to kind of expand our understanding of what guilt entailed. And so he came up with this idea of the crime complex, in which, as long as you were a part of a group, if you were part of the complex, if you were a telephone operator or a cook or a guard or a bus driver, you were fueling the armature of genocide. And that is still how these cases are handled today in Germany. And according to that, all you need to prove is your membership in a killing unit. And according to that interpretation, Cukurs is guilty beyond a doubt. You don't need to show that he pulled the trigger on this day or that day.
And just to round off that part of the story, the appeal, sorry, he was exonerated, I think, in 2019, but there's an appeal against that, isn't there?
Yeah, so indeed, the prosecutor's office, is the Prosecutor General of Latvia, issued a decision initially saying that they had looked at the preponderance of evidence, they had read all the books, including the memoir by the lead Mossad assassin, and they had determined that, in fact, it is impossible to know if Cukurs pulled the trigger himself, but also acknowledge that he was part of the Arājs Kommando, and acknowledged that he was present in Rumbula on the day of the massacres, but suggested that we don't know if he got out of the car. And that alone was enough to suggest that he might not be guilty, And so to the Jewish community, this was outrageous, scandalous, to suggest that one of the most prominent perpetrators could in fact be innocent. And so they issued one appeal, which was rejected, and another which was finally accepted. And so the case remains in abeyance, it remains open. And that's a kind of convenient place for it to be without a decision.
But I mean, I often think about the children and grandchildren of Holocaust victims, or ones who survived and were able to give testimonies on the kind of inherited trauma and grief you often read about. And do you feel this yourself, having learned more about your grandfather?
I mean, yes, to a certain extent. I think part of the reason I felt compelled to write the book, and as if I didn't have a choice to, was to kind of like confront this history and acknowledge my own implication in it. And I knew that if I didn't do it, I would always wonder and worry about it. And I think through the process of discovery and exposure, to me, that was one way of understanding my own relation to this story and my own inheritances. But yeah, I don't think it's something that is concluded, right? Because these are stories that are unfortunately, part of your DNA. And so, you have to pass it along to future generations. And so that's what I'm thinking about right now, is how do you tell a story, to those, who come up underneath me, and through education, but also through kind of like very deliberately telling the story for what it is, and kind of not sugarcoating what happened.
The subtitle of your book is How the Holocaust Ends, and how does it end then? I mean, we're at a time, as you said, when there are very few witnesses left. Pretty soon there won't be anyone. The central office you write about in Germany in the book, which collates a lot of this information and material, is scheduled to close in a couple of years' time. In fact, just 2 years away. How does it end? And then how do we then remember it and make sure we don't forget and we take action to stop it happening again?
Yeah, I write in the prologue that the subtitle, which I kind of agonized about for so long, that it's not meant as a prescription, right? How the Holocaust ends. It's not how democracy ends. You know, it's more of a provocation and a warning, right? It's a question about that acknowledges, I hope, that we are in this moment where we are at an ending. We are at a moment where in this period of history is transitioning as to how we think of it. And we need to think about what that means. But it's also an acknowledgement that we will never get the ending that we want. There will never be this sense of completion or finality. And, when I'm asked about this subtitle, I often think back to one of the archival artifacts I found in the Wiener Library in London, which was from a Jewish survivor named Joseph Berman. And he was sent to confront one of the perpetrators that he recognized from the Riga ghetto. And at the time, this perpetrator, Rees, he was in West German custody awaiting trial, and his trial never, in fact, happened. And Rees begs Berman for forgiveness. He asks him to spend time alone with him in the prison cell, and they share the same cigarette, and they embrace. And the Nazi, he cries and gets down on his knees. And Berman says, "Okay, if you confess from A to Z, I will, help you in some way." And so Rees starts speaking, and none of what he says can be used in court because he's too distraught. And then Berman, later reflecting on that, he says, it occurred to me that even if he was to confess from A to Z, how would I know when it is Z? How would he know when it was the end? And I think that's the question of all stories, but it's kind of what we have to confront when we're thinking about the Holocaust, when it was a deliberate campaign of erasure, right? The bodies were destroyed, the evidence was destroyed. This is what we call genocide. And our desire for completion, for forensic truth, is almost a desire for that not to have happened, which of course, but it did, and we need to, I don't know, understand that. I think for me, that was what it was about.
There's also a very important point you made. I think you took it from another scholar from Armenia, I think, about trials and how sometimes they don't work because the facts can be challenged and falsified, and that doesn't move things on sometimes.
Yes, exactly. That is Mark Nichanian, who's just an incredible philosopher and scholar of the Armenian genocide. And he has written so beautifully about the kind of impossibility of reconciliation, and the practicalities of politics, after a period like this. And so, he says that the survivor must continually come and prove his own death, because you are always kind of operating on the level of the perpetrator when you call the crime into question. And he writes about not only in the Armenian genocide were the killing fields destroyed, but also the records of attempts to document what happened there were also subsequently destroyed. And so if you have this complete absence of evidence, you only have erasure. How do you move on from that, And I think the answer is ultimately, a kind of mourning, a kind of memorialization that allows for public grief in a way that is not debilitating, but allows you to move forward somehow.
I mean, that's very much the approach we've tried to do in Bristol in recent years over its history of involvement in the trade in enslaved people. And Latvia has its own memorials you write about. It has its Stolpersteine, the stumbling stones. You look at what Germany did many years after the Second World War in terms of West Germany, particularly coming to terms with the past. But it can shift over time, can't it? It feels like things sometimes aren't established. There's been the relatively recent case in Poland of the writers of the book about the Polish Holocaust being taken to court over a tiny fragment of that book by Holocaust deniers. How is Latvia doing now, do you think, in terms of memorializing what has happened?
Well, I think one of the beautiful things is that it's starting to be more organic. It's starting to be more community-based, which I think is, memory can't be dictated, but I do think for over a half century it was. And so there has to be this kind of period in which you let that kind of memory from on high dissipate and dissolve and think about what you want your own strategies to be, which I think is really interesting. But, I think memorials are constantly evolving, and strategies for memorialization necessarily have to change. And there's this wonderful book that just came out by Andrew Schenken, who's a architectural historian, and it's called The Everyday Life of Memorials. And he writes about how, right now we're rightfully concerned with the taking down of memorials and the replacing of them and what to do with these public spaces. But he warns, let us not mistake the memorials for the history itself. Let us not think that in taking down this statue, we are also doing away with this history. It will still be there. It still will fester. We still need to confront it and deal with it. And putting the statue in a storage hold or there has to be some kind of public display. And I think some of the efforts to kind of melt down the statues, make them into something different, can be quite powerful.
I mean, interestingly, in Bristol, when the statue of Edward Colston was pulled down and thrown into the river, it was pulled out and was put on display in the City Museum. They thought long and hard about how exactly they should display the statue, whether it should be vertical or horizontal or slightly on a tilt. There was a public vote by people who visited on where they thought the statue should end up. And the view generally was end up in the museum, contextualized. Yeah. Now that leaves in the centre of Bristol an empty plinth at the moment. What do you put on an empty plinth? And I think there's many people have different views. If I give a personal view, I would leave it empty, to be honest, or use it as a temporary space for temporary artworks, much as the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square is, which I think works extremely well. So, but these are the issues that we're dealing with are not dissimilar to the ones that you've talked there about, that Latvia deals with, or indeed others deal with. Since the publication of your book, and which isn't very long, I have to say, has anything new come to light? Has anybody provided anything which has surprised you or you'd hoped to receive?
I've received a lot of letters from people with similar family histories, who have, mysteries that they are, on their own kind of probing and exploring, and also people who are trying to build memorials as well. I will say, I love the idea of empty plinths, and throughout the Soviet Union, and certainly in Ukraine, that is the decision that has been made. And in the center of Kiev, where the old Lenin used to stand, that was taken down during the Maidan Revolution, it remains empty, but it's become a kind of community memorial. And so depending on what's going on, there will be a different, series of items there. And I talked to some people who, I believe many, many years ago, were building a kind of blockchain statue on the old Lenin, which I thought was quite funny. But anyway, has anything new come up? Yes, after the excerpt in the Guardian long read came out, there was a picture of my grandfather there, and I got a message from someone saying, my grandfather was also in that closed Soviet city, and he told the story of one day coming across the body of a man who had committed suicide in Silame, and he was found next to his gun, and in his pocket was a letter saying, "I'm sorry, Commander, I could not fulfill this mission." And, I have no way of knowing if that's true. I have no way of knowing if that man was indeed my grandfather. But it's another story to kind of add to the list.
Yeah. You'll probably never get quite to the bottom of it all, I'm afraid to say. But Ukraine is part of the story, of course, and you're a long-time visitor to Ukraine. And your article in the New York Times, I thought, was one of the finest things I've read on Ukraine, about the rebuilding of the cities after this terrible war has ended. At some point, Russians, I very much hope, will go on trial for war crimes. What lessons do you see from your work on this book to ensure that as much evidence and proof has been gathered? What should we be doing now, and what is being done now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, there's so much to say. I mean, we are speaking on the February 24th, which is the, anniversary of the full-scale invasion, and it's kind of, this horrible marker in so many ways. And, since that date, there have been many, many discussions about what these future trials might look like. What I have learned is that in a situation like this, you need to do everything you can to collect as much evidence as close to the event as possible, and in a way that will not allow it to be thrown out of court in the present or in the future. And so I've been working with this group called the Reckoning Project, which is an incredible organization. It's the kind of brainchild of Janine Di Giovanni, Peter Pomerantsev, and Natalia Gumenyuk, all of whom are kind of incredible investigative journalists. And the idea is to train journalists to collect testimonies on the ground in Ukraine in a way that is legally admissible, because journalists are often the first people who respond after an invasion or an atrocity has taken place. And they conduct interviews, but if a witness isn't interviewed too many times, they cannot be used in court. And so the idea is to kind of blend these two approaches in a way that will expedite justice. So I very much hope it works. I have been working with them not only on the testimonies, but also trying to think about what a public archive of those testimonies and accounts might look like, so that we can kind of shore up this war against any efforts at denial.
And just coming back to the Holocaust, I've seen two remarkable films recently, or I felt they were remarkable. The first, I don't know whether you've had a chance to see these yet. The first was called 3 Minutes, a lengthening about Poland in 1938. 3 minutes of film about a place and then what happened to that place afterwards and the people there. And then the series by Ken Burns, Lynn Novick and Stara Botstein, the US and the Holocaust. Yeah. I find these both incredibly moving, provided me with new information, which I thought I knew enough about this subject, but reading your book and watching those films made me realize I still don't know everything. In fact, there's one moment in the Ken Burns, Novick and Botstein documentary where one of the speakers, I think it's Daniel Mendelsohn, says, just when you think you know everything about this subject, something new comes along. And then there was a piece of film just after he spoke, which I'd never seen before and which horrified me. Do you have any views on those, if you've had a chance to see them, or why these films should, continue to be important?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I think, this illustrates exactly why there's like this ongoing need for historiography of this period, right? And the role that the United States played in not intervening early enough and kind of not taking an interest in the kind of genocidal campaign remains kind of one of the biggest blights on this nation. And I don't think that many Americans are familiar with that story. So I do think that that documentary is doing a great public service in exposing that. But also, I think part of this, there's always something new, of course, but there always has to be a new way of telling the story. I think we are at this moment when, both in Germany and the United States, I think that this is taken so much for granted that people will be familiar with this because, we grew up with these stories and were told them in school, but there's a new generation of people in charge, of teachers and lawyers and the like, for which those assumptions have been so ingrained that they have become forgotten almost, or like taken for granted. So I think any new way of telling it is so valuable. And I think that documentaries like that I hope they keep coming.
Final thing we're looking at this year in the context of this, but much wider aspects of human rights, is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and provides us with an opportunity to revisit many of these issues, as well as to look at the future of human rights. And I think keeping learning about these things and taking action on them is a key part of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Thank you, Linda. Come to This Court and Cry, How the Holocaust Ends is published here by Bloomsbury and is out now. Thank you, Linda Kinstler, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a pleasure.